Daniel Seraldo with the Miami Design Preservation League. Thank you to those who braved the crazy weather outside. It was really, I was saying it reminds us of our tropical fragility. But we're also recording this, so we're very excited. For those who are watching on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And this is the fourth in our lecture series. It's all about Morris Lapidus. And I'm really excited about this one because we're closing with the local story and his local legacy, and we have some real rock stars here tonight for that. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Deborah Desilets, who has been an amazing curator, and she will move the program forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So it clicks and works, right? Here we go. Morris Lapidus was a colleague for 7 years. I met him at Architectonica's office when he came and team critiqued a group of student work on hotels. And at the end of that critique, Lorenda Spears said, "Take him home." So when I took him to the car and I opened the door for him, he was old, he was 93, and I said, "Mr. Lapidus, what was the most devastating moment of your career?" And he said, "Oh, that would be the Monte Carlo story." And I said, "Well, if I like it," he said, "but it's a long story." And I said, "Well, if I like it, I'll drive slow." And we got in the car and it began a conversation that really did last for 7 entire years. So he said at the end of his life, heaven is a place where good friends sit and talk. The men that are coming tonight to speak with me, I consider friends. So I hope you feel a little bit of heaven around us, because we have had a wonderful time reminiscing and thinking about the fond memories that we have had with Morris Lapidus. So I'm going to introduce each of them and let them introduce their connection to Lapidus to you. So Allan Shulman is first, coming up.
So I'm Allan Shulman. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Miami School of Architecture and also principal of Shulman and Associates. And my own research has touched on Lapidus in different ways at different times. I've been very interested, of course, in local themes like Lincoln Road and the grand hotels that he did. But, you know, I've also more recently, I was working on a project researching the Bacardi and found that Lapidus had done many buildings for distillers, right? In particular for the Seagram Company. So yes, we can talk more about that.
We're going to ask you more about that later. Our next guest with us is Jean-François Lejeune.
Okay, so Deborah, thank you so much, and I think this is a really great, absolutely fabulous initiative that we should continue with other architects. But Jean-François Lejeune, originally from Belgium, born in Belgium, and studied in Liège and then in Delft in the Netherlands, teaching at the University of Miami as well. Allan actually was one of my first students, so you know it's kind of nice to always rejoin together. We've been interested. I have not actually written specifically anything about Lapidus, but Allan and I certainly have been very involved in various parts of the history of Miami architecture and urban planning. So one way or another, there is no way that you can do that without encountering the figure of Maurice Lapidus. On the same topic, let's say in the same period, I just published a book with Victor Dupi on Cuban modernism, 1940-1970, which I think we're going to at least allude to in relationship from Lapidus and his colleagues and the potential work in Cuba.
Thank you. And the last but not least, Ira Giller.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming in the rain. My name is Ira Giller. I'm president of Giller & Giller Architects. Miami Beach's oldest architectural firm. It was founded by my father, who was a contemporary, 3/4 of a generation removed from Morris Lapidus. but in the 50s and 60s, there was very much, they were all in the same milieu of hotels and motels and Miami Beach. And in later years, I had the pleasure of spending time with Morris at the Thursday luncheon of the Miami Beach Kiwanis Club. Got to know a little bit more about the personal side of Morris. And I've also had the pleasure of working on some of his buildings in expanding or renovating over the years. So I've had a close contact that way. Looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Thank you. So we're going to show a series of slides. So the lights will go down. We'll show about 5 slides to set a context, and then we'll come back up and we're going to riff on the context or the images that we've just seen. And I think at the end we can ask questions, but also if you have questions along the way, because those will be in context, it will also be okay. So if you want to ask a few pertinent questions along the way, let us know. Okay, so I'm going to show you about 10 slides that sort of summarizes the hurricane that was, the hurricane that was Morris Lapidus.
Maybe we should turn off that. Okay, perfect.
From 1902 to 2001, that's the legacy of, that's a span of time we're looking at. He was, in the end, considered the architect of the American dream. At this moment, it's MiMo. And I wanted to give you more of Morris's MiMo. And I wanted to embrace Beatrice Perlman, his wife at this moment, and thank her for her contribution to the successes of this incredible man. I was mentioning to Ira that Morris Lapidus was a late bloomer. He always said, I'm a late bloomer. I'm 52 years old and I'm doing my first building. And he had graduated from school in 1929. So by the time he did do his really first building with the Fontainebleau, he considered himself very late on the deck. But he started at the top of the deck. And he would come from Brooklyn. So a Brooklyn boy, there's always a little bit of Brooklyn in the house when you see Lapidus. So in the Brooklyn-esque way of speaking about it, he would show himself from Brooklyn to Miami, and then after taking over Miami, he would go into the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean, he would go back into Washington, and then obviously do more things around the country. But in this arc of work that he did, it would be 1,200 projects, and with 2 firms, 40 men in New York, and or in Miami, and 20 in New York, and he would see an incredible career emerge over that period of time from within a 30-year period. You would see about 500 projects done. That's a huge amount of work. Yeah. So Morris is known in Miami Beach for the mid-century modern district, and he's also known for the hotels that he did. The MiMo district speaks to his luxury apartment buildings that came after the hotels. But he also went on to do a project that was never built in Sunny Islands, and Sunny Isles, that's the Interrama site that became the international mart for him. And then he did do 17 cranes at Aventura and the original site planning at Aventura. So you could consider him to be the original architect of Aventura, Florida. The Aventura project, I'm giving it a little bit of note because we never really hear it mentioned in his au revoir, and so I just wanted you to know that this was to him one of the largest projects of his office, and he figured one of his best. The Interrama project, Morris said this project was never built, but it was one of the best. It was the ultimate in the use of curves. And it was to be a huge merchandise mart, including a hotel, to be part of a permanent World's Fair in Florida on a large site called the Interrama. The distillery building that we were just speaking about was done for the 1939 World's Fair. So Morris certainly was aware of what World Fairs look like. And so to him, this was certainly within the language of a World's Fair. And it was pretty exotic and pretty outrageous. So we would have something that most people don't know either, is that he would do the first cruise ships out of the port of Miami. He did the Mardi Gras for Ted Aronson. Ted Aronson called him and said, I have a ship in Israel, will you come see it? I want to outfit it. Tell me, do you think it can be done? And he crawled through the structure of the boat and figured out how to do it. In 1943, he'd been asked by Aetna to look at the cruise ships, the ships coming back from the war, and asked by that insurance company, can you figure a way to make this into a cruise ship for us? And that project never launched. But by 1973 with Aronson, these did launch. And that's a funny story because the Mardi Gras launched, it hit a sandbar, and for 3 days they partied while the water rose, and then it sailed off to sea for the first time. Having everybody being completely launched on the ship. So we can see in one other instance of a project not gotten was the Igor Polavitsky project in the Tropicana, which you might want to talk about. Cuba was always there in the background of Miami. And maybe Francois, you can speak about that a little bit more, but I wanted to make that comment is that we always knew there was tension there. Lapidus never designed in Cuba, but this would have been the project if he would have designed in Cuba.
Excuse me, is that the Tropicana nightclub?
Yes, yes, exactly. So Morris said he did not have a style. He said style is not permanent, but he said beauty, that which Vitruvius called delight, is. And Morris made an architectural career of trying to please people. So with that being said, I would like for us to open up a discussion between us on topics that have just been mentioned.
Well, I had one connection to what you just said.
Okay.
Said about Polavitsky and Lapidus. I was thumbing through an old album from my father and mother, and my father's wedding was in 1946, and there was a letter from Igor Polavitsky's secretary saying that he regrets that he could not attend the wedding.
Oh,
Oh,
Interesting.
oh, how
And
nice.
I just came across that a few weeks ago. It was mentioned, and that just
Wow.
surprised me. But what a connection! The architecture in Miami is very diverse, but we've got a very small circle of connections as well.
I think they all knew each other and respected
Yes.
each other. We all know that, Morris did the first 5 hotels that he did as an associate architect. So what does that really mean to be an associate? And I think that's a good discussion for all of us.
Some of that's a context too, because back in the 50s and even into the 60s, there was an awful lot of not only the architect, but the draftspersons, as we call them now, or CAD operators today, but that they would work on a project, especially a big project. When that would end, everybody was looking for more work, so they'd go to somebody else's office. So there was a lot of sharing and interaction amongst the offices in the late 40s and in the 50s, and so there was a bit of a commonality and
So where did Maurice get his license?
New York.
Actually? New York, right? And at that time, you could just transfer your license.
And he was in CARB as well.
Yeah.
But at that time, no, you couldn't just transfer it. He did the first 5 projects in Florida as an associate architect.
As associate because he was not.
Because he was not
Exactly.
licensed.
Exactly.
And so that was how that became the reality. But speaking to the point of the draftsmen migrating and moving around, people have always wondered how was it that these 25 architects created 350 to 500 buildings in this area that have such consistency, but the traveling draftsman has never been, that might just have solved that
the mystery. Yeah.
Because if you're sharing your drafts board between men, you're sharing the DNA. And I mean, the DNA of our design work is done on our drafting tables, right?
where people would need help. I need a month of drafting help. If you got 3, 4 people, you can lend me for a month, and they share that way. So there was an awful lot of interaction
And
as a
consistency in the
community.
environment.
It was a close community. People knew what the offices were doing and who was supporting it and where some of the design details came from. They didn't all come from the top.
And do we actually know who worked for him?
I do.
You
I have
We know
I
some.
have a,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
I do. And he left, how would you say, a complete resume of all of the workers.
Of all this.
Yes.
And so are there some people that we know well? Of the
Lorenda
next,
Spear is one
of the
of
next
them.
generation?
Yes, Lorenda Spear worked for him.
Yes, but she worked
Bob
also for
Swedroe.
she also worked for Polavitsky, right?
I don't know
I
that
don't know
she
about
did.
that.
I don't know about that.
Because I think the collection, at least if we follow the sort of roots of donation, the collection of Polavitsky at the History Miami is actually donated by her.
By Lorinda Smith.
So I think she at some point mentioned,
Well, then that
so
would
she
be
may
very-
very well have been one of those traveling
Yeah.
from one office to another office,
That,
actually.
that could be very true.
Yeah,
Joe
probably, yeah.
Farkas is another,
Yeah.
and Joe Farkas left Lapidus's office to do the Carnival Cruise Lines. We walked in on the party at Bamboo. This is a funny anecdotal story, but Lapidus was kind of sad that he read the newspaper that their Carnival is celebrating their 25th anniversary, and he was left out. That's, okay, that's happening. So he's at home and feeling blue, and I could feel it. So I told him, get dressed, I'm taking you out to party. And I didn't know a thing about any other parties, but I said, I'm taking you out. Bamboo had just opened, it was Cameron Diaz's new restaurant. It was unbelievable, right? Everybody had to go, so we thought, I said, I'm taking you there. We get there, and we pull up in the taxi, because I'm dressed too nicely to drive, and he's dressed too nicely to drive, and we're gonna make sure that we make a scene. And the red carpet was rolled out. This was the Carnival Cruise Line party that we were busting. Okay, so I'm trying to scramble to get around the back of the boot of the taxi, and Steven Seagal comes and sees that somebody important is coming, and he opens the door. And he takes Mr. Lapidus by his big breast and swoops him into the red carpet and moves people away. And who's coming out and has to dodge us is Joe Farkas.
Interesting.
It was hilarious. It was karmic.
Yeah.
This was destiny. So
That's a side of Morris that, as you got to know him better, you and I experienced that. I don't know if the two of you had much interaction. He was a great storyteller, and he enjoyed a good story. But his storytelling was verbal, it was with his books, and it was with architecture, his buildings. He told great stories. He understood the importance of storytelling in our culture.
and in
And appreciated
architecture.
it.
But it's also interesting because there are very few architects in Florida who actually wrote. You know, that actually makes research on architects in Florida relatively difficult because very rarely do you have their words, right? So Maurice eventually wrote two books,
No,
right?
more.
Two or
No,
three,
more
two
than that.
or three books, and
Five
then
books.
Five books, yeah.
five
Five
books,
books.
and then you have our friend in Jacksonville, William Morgan, who also kind of the same period, in fact, right? Than definitely the same period than Maurice, although younger, I think.
Yeah.
So, who also published three or four books, and they almost like the only, because when I'm talking books, it's just not like a coffee table with photograph in color of your work. I'm talking really books that comment, explain, and provide a philosophy of life or philosophy of architecture, and they're rare in Florida. They're very
And
rare in
books that
Florida.
went beyond his own work, right?
Yeah.
Because he was kind of an anthropologist too. He
Oh,
was
yes.
very
Yeah,
interested
it's-
in the
yeah.
human history,
In
the
human-
human
exactly.
condition, and
Well, he said, client, there's not a straight bone in the human body. And, you know, we're all, how would you say, human nature is the driving force behind people, and he wanted to really understand people. People were his client. And so for him to get at people, he thought that there was these driving things that made people tick. And in the end, he would experiment with his laboratory of design in merchandising and selling merchandising and creating a theater of merchandising in his 22 years of store design. And then by the time he became an architect for these associate buildings and for the Fontainebleau, he had already developed a way of selling merchandise. He began selling a good time. But his 3 Million Year Odyssey was written in his 80s after he had already done all that experiment, and he wanted to kind of like retract or kind of look at it. Was I really onto something? Was there really something here? Is there something like human nature? Is there really something that makes people tick? Was I onto something?
Yeah.
So in a way, his search after, in his 80s, when he was doing that and writing about that, was to sort of get at the DNA of human nature, and had he really discovered anything interesting to add to the conversation of what makes architecture tick, what makes architecture work.
yeah.
So I think that was a good book.
And he seemed to like even go beyond architecture, right? He was kind of interested in how the whole planet worked and how he was kind of a big thinker.
I think he was a Zelig character. If you've seen the
Yeah.
Woody Allen movie Zelig,
Yes,
right?
it was,
I
yeah.
mean, Lapidus is really a Zelig type
Yeah.
character because you
He
have
could
him.
have played in a film.
I mean, he could have played in that film. He was traveling to see Alvar Aalto. He was traveling to see Gil Ponte. He was traveling to see Oscar Niemeyer. He was making pilgrimages to meet other men so that he could really validate, what am I doing? And the drive to be validated, I think, Alan, you've picked up on that several times when you're talking about the immigrant and the immigrant desire to be recognized or to get recognition. So I think you're onto something, that Lapidus wasn't content that he had made any mark at all in architecture. He was still on a quest to see if his quest for emotion and motion in architecture was really world-worthy. Did these audiences of men, did they appreciate what he would say? So he was...
I think it was a generational thing, too. It started with Morris's generation. He was born in 1902. The early immigrants, some were driven to not be what they came from. Others in the next generation were again driven to be something having come from relatively modest middle class, lower middle class background and beginning to rise up. And when you think about it in the context of architecture, historically, so many architects over the centuries were architects to the rich and the wealthy and the church, or to the monarchy. There were not a lot of Jewish architects achieving that. I remember hearing from my father and Morris both that architecture was not a Jewish profession as they were coming up, and they were. It was something to get beyond it, and at one respect, they were concerned of, were they really successful, and by the same token, they were driven to be successful, and that balance and that dichotomy followed their lives and their contemporaries. You see it they speak of the World War II, the greatest generation. What drove them to rise up and become and do?
Maybe with Lapidus, what's interesting is it's very poignant. His quest was also a kind of a lonely quest, right? Because the things that he was interested in were not the agenda of his period at the beginning, right? He was interested in the human dimension, he was interested in emotion, he was interested in the human, the workings of the human mind and everything. I don't think many architects were doing that, and that meant that the goal of being accepted, right, must have been all the more difficult.
And then when he had the critical knocking with the Fontainebleau and thereafter, that really put him on a very lonely path of wanting to be accepted and finding internal comfort individually that he was a success and he was comfortable with who he was. And that drove him for a long time.
Did your father and he ever discuss these things? Or?
Sometimes at the Kiwanis, it was interesting. We'd get into some discussions from time to time. We had a full range of discussions. There was a comparison between Morris and his relationship with his son Allan as a practicing architect and my father and myself. And I remember Morris saying he admired the fact that my father and I found a way to work together, and he struggled to make it work with Allan. And my response to him was, it wasn't because of me that it made it work, it was my father that gave me room to grow and do and see things a little differently. And I think Morris, I didn't know Allan very well because he was in New York, but they struggled with that relationship. And then at another time, Morris brought Allan down and came to my dad and I and said, let's pursue what now became the Lowe's Hotel on a joint venture as a local architectural package. And it didn't gain traction. But in his later years, I think he felt he was reaching out to, particularly Allan, to looking for ways of trying to make that connection. His son
Allan
Rick-
suffered more than Lapidus for his insults, and because really and honestly, Allan would mention that he's this young boy coming up at Columbia, and the teachers go, "You're a Lapidus, ugh," and they dismissed him. And so I think Allan suffered more. And we lost Allan 2 weeks ago.
Really?
So I
Oh.
want to make that note here that I want his memory, the afterlife of Allan should be a good remembrance. And so I certainly do want to say that Allan and his father had a very good, strong relationship, and that they did have dialogues, always trying to find ways that they could have more dialogues together. But I do think that none of the projects that we're looking at here had anything to do with his son, right? I mean,
Right.
so we should say Allan came to work with him after he graduated, which would have been in '65 or a little later. But the point is that in terms of the agina and the discussion about Lapidus and how did he feel about all of this criticism and the critics, he had a childhood friend that happened to appear in his life at the time that the Fontainebleau became successful in the Eden Rock and the Bal Harbour Sheraton. And his name was Manny Panovsky. So this is another mystery person in Morris's life. Who was Manny? Manny was the other half of Ellery Queen. He was the ghostwriter. There were two boys that wrote Ellery Queen.
Yeah.
Manny Panovsky wrote the narrative, and his cousin wrote the plot. The two of these boys would show up at book signings with bags over their head.
Really?
And they would not identify each other, like being one or the other, because it was too important for Ellery to ever be known who he was. He would be killed on the spot. So they had to always travel with the two of them. And Manny Panovsky would begin this dialogue with Lapidus saying, "You're crazy. It's not parasites, it's your head. You are a successful man on your own. I have this load of my cousin who does the plots, and I have to fill in the narrative, and I'm not my own man. I run around with a bag on my head. You are your own man. You make this happen. This is you." And an onion skin paper that's been carbon printed. So the other copy is with the Ellery Queen collection, I think, in Texas. We have the onion skin collections of Ellery or Manny telling him, "Stop it. Stop this. Go on your own way." So I think he had a childhood friend that really, at that moment, from boys, from the little boys' school that they went together in New York, they bonded again. And Morris then really did go on his own quest, and he did say, "Damn the critics." So, but I do think he did have a conspirator in that he had a friend that he could lean on, but I do think he got a lot of bullying. He was not written about for 50 years. In the architectural profession, Dean Silvetti says, "Who's afraid of Lapidus?" Why was what he was doing so criticized? And maybe you guys can talk about the critics.
But it's also interesting because eventually when you look back at the criticism and you're trying to interpret it, in fact, you realize that it's not his architecture that was that much criticized. It's actually, I would say, the inner architecture, or the interior architecture, or the decoration. But you didn't really see or hear major criticism about, let's say, the very architecture of the Fontainebleau. For example, the way the windows were treated, the treatments of the balconies, or the Eden Rock projecting window frame, which have always made me think about Joe Ponti, and you mentioned Joe Ponti, because I always thought that there was a connection.
Yes.
Implicit or between Ponti, and because Ponti would be somebody who also would make very provocative clashes between pieces. Of course, within an Italian context, much more, probably much more aristocratic, late aristocratic, but in fact, his architecture has never been, so it's an interesting thing, because usually people are criticized for their architecture. That's not what happened to him.
But what was unique with the Fontainebleau and in Morris's design services, he had the whole continuum. He designed everything. So you couldn't separate what you're now talking today, the exterior of the Fontainebleau from the interior of the Fontainebleau, from the doorknobs and the bellhops' uniforms and the furniture and the pianos and the antiques and the statues.
Well,
that was all Morris.
No,
He
he was the designer of everything. But I actually think you could detach it, because we can also look at the spaces that he created. For example, the Eden Rock lobby with this wonderful circular space. Okay, what was essentially criticized was not necessarily the form or the space that he created, it was just the way that he actually framed it, right? With the type of columns, although those columns were very Ponty-like, and you can find many, many connections. So eventually we could say, from a pure architectural aspect, space. He had a good sense of space.
He had a very
he had a
he
good
was
sense of
brilliant
space.
with space.
Yes,
I mean,
it was
those
great.
ground floor lobby spaces were, so influential. I mean, they
Fluidity of
Yes.
spaces.
affected many other
know.
architects.
So
many
yes,
other
yes.
architects.
So you're right, and at the same time, you could imagine that the interior of the Fontainebleau would be totally redone by a modern architect, and it wouldn't necessarily hurt me. From a historic point of view, yes, but from a design point of view, I think you could pretty much absorb it.
Go back to the lobby story, because
because
I heard
that's an
the story
important.
when I was very young. I heard my father describe it, and then I heard Morris talk about it as well. The Miami Beach hotels were so very different than most other hotels in the country, but particularly think of a New York hotel. Very small lobby.
Yeah.
Many of the lobbies weren't even on the main floor. The main floor was up 3-4 stories in the air. The lobby was something to pass through to get to the desk, to get to your room.
Yes, yeah.
In the 50s, the hotels, whether it was Morris Lapidus or Norman Giller or Mel Grossman, all of a sudden the lobby became the space. It became, as Morris described it, the parade of people. The minx walking through the lobby, the stair from nowhere to come down. That was all part of this escapism that suddenly became Miami and Miami Beach in the 50s.
Well, he exploded the lobby outside the confines of the building, right?
Exactly.
Like the Fontainebleau, it just explodes in every direction. And it's so free form, right? And I think that's part of the curves and the curvaceousness of the building. Beyond the top, I don't find the tower very curvaceous because it's a single curve, but the ground is just it's all bulbous and there's things coming in and out. And then he took advantage of that to create that scenography that was so important, the theater of the hotel, right? He wanted people to walk in the door and feel like they were the star and be able to, merge seamlessly into these different rooms, I think. And that's what was so influential.
Think about it in the context of the 50s and what else was going on in America at the time. The war vets were home. They were 10 years or so post-war. They were beginning to be successful. They were looking for escapism. They were looking for, let's go to foreign places. We were at foreign places. Let's re-engage our families in getting out of our normal lives. Think about where Walt Disney was and thinking about Disneyland. And some of the comments we have about Morris, and you talk about the interiors of the Fontainebleau and almost the stage setting and the vignettes. Disney was doing the same thing. It was
Disney
very much
came
of
a
the
year
time.
later, actually, than the Fontainebleau. It opened in '55, so the Fontainebleau was preceded Disney. What's interesting about what we're saying is Lapidus themed events, and he obviously created theater in it. In that way, I think he broke the architectural fourth wall, which is he made people the performers, and I think he made people know they were performing.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the big difference, is that people knew when they came into his environment, they were center stage of something. And this was the phenomenon of Lapidus, breaking that fourth wall, where all of a sudden now, people knew they were engaged in coming down the stair. The husband would go to the first floor, the wife would go to the mezzanine and then walk down the stair to nowhere with her minks and her rings and wave to who? Her husband. Okay.
Exactly.
But the world was watching. Okay. Okay, so the husband became the foil for this great moment for his wife.
it's
Why
also-
not? It's very human. It's very human. It's very touching. And we can talk about what it takes to break the fourth wall in acting. When people, like in the Camino Real with Tennessee Williams, when they walk out and you all of a sudden he's talking to you there in the theater, right? Just like I'm talking to you. That is the breakdown of that fourth wall. He allowed that moment to happen where people could break through and be almost magical at that
I
moment.
want to say it a little differently. He understood the need for people to want that.
Yes, I think that's true too. I think.
which is not a new, not a new discovery, because
No.
I mean, I've always been interested to see how badly architectural critiques have always seen scenography. Like, how many times the word scenographic is used as a negative criticism of architecture. Still, it's perhaps a little less now, but for a long, long time, oh, it's scenographic, as if it was like a bad idea. If you take the Paris Opera by Garnier, which is one of the first actually real development of that idea of theatrical,
Yes.
it was the same thing. It was the same thing. People were going up and down the staircase before going to the opera. I mean, it's never been criticized as a fact. Maybe you could criticize the architecture. So what happened is that in a way, Lapidus brought back
Yes.
some of those elements that the modernist, the Puritan modernists, as had been mentioned a couple of times during
Yes.
this series, have kind of eliminated. You know, this idea of theatrical should not be, you know, it's something that architect shouldn't deal with that. It's very strange. Because also, strangely enough, when he dealt with theaters, he was not so good. Perhaps. Although, I mean, the Guzman Theater at UM is him as well, right? It's his project.
That is his, yeah.
I mean, it's just, when he had the opportunity to really do a theater, or maybe the remaking of the Miami Beach, Jackie Gleason also, he intervened in there. I don't think he necessarily was doing his best with that, which is somewhat strange. We could, I mean, there are some elements of the Guzman at UM that are interesting, but you couldn't say, like the lobby there, for example, is
It doesn't
totally...
feel like Lapidus.
It doesn't feel, but
touch in a way.
no,
It's funny you should say that, because I made a comment.
because it's he did that one,
You know,
right? He was.
Well,
think
we're
of
talking
Lapidus-
about the theater now that Morris did. He did the Theater of the Performing Arts. We're talking about the Colony Theater, which was the last project of his
Yes.
career. And then you're talking about the Gusman on the University of
On
Miami
University of
campus.
Miami.
And why did he make theaters over the top? Okay, the question is, why did he not? I think
Yeah.
I have an answer for that, but I also would like to hear what you say.
But we think of Morris and we think of Fountainblue. They're connected, and that's it. But as you pointed out, it was his first major building.
First,
And he had a lot of buildings after that had nothing to do with some
No,
of the things we're talking
absolutely.
about.
No, no,
the
absolutely.
flamboyance,
No, no.
the experience of a hotel. I worked on buildings that he did, the fire station.
The fire station, the
on near Miami
synagogue,
Beach.
the synagogue in Coral Gables.
The
on
Hebrew,
Synagogue in Coral
which
Gables,
is very-
work that he did at Mount Sinai.
Yes, it's
And those were well-detailed buildings that had none of the statuary in the lobby.
no,
Right.
I think Lapidus would say that the Fontainebleau was a fantasy, right? It was all theater.
Yeah.
And for him, doing the theaters was the container for others to experience theater. He made the best sound men come down from New York. Those are some of the best acoustics. The acousticians that he had came in, and they did some of the best panels that reverse, so that if it's a piano, you get one side. If it's a vocal, you turn the panel to the other side. So I think what Lapidus is doing at that moment is he's not saying, this is my theater. No, he's saying this is what a theater really needs is great sound and a great lighting. And I don't think that anybody would argue that the Gusmans that he did at the Flagler or the Gusman on the University of Miami campus fails in those characteristics that are theatrical for the needs of other theatrics.
Because perhaps he didn't feel that the theater had to be theatrical.
I don't think he did. I mean, I
Maybe.
don't
Which
think
he didn't want to
I don't
intervene,
think,
right?
I don't think that he wanted to subject his theatricality, because even when he did the restoration of the Gusman, he loved doing it. He had done, most people don't know it, but in New York he had done the first speakeasies and those the Palace de Royale. So when you look at some of those older works that he had in his books, like the Palace Royale that was a ballroom with all of these things in it, you could see he was a Beaux-Arts trained architect. He had never forgotten that. But the idea that he would, in 1970, I think, when he was doing the Gusman, that he would put all of that on top of No, I think he absorbed some of the brutalism of that period.
Yes,
And I
exactly,
think that was a
exactly.
fabulous
Yeah.
thing for
And
him.
in fact, the lobby is exterior. The lobby,
the
is,
lobby is
under,
exterior. It's
the
under the
lobby is
building.
under
Yes,
the
and-
slope of the ranking of the
Exactly.
auditorium.
Which is a
So-
type.
Which is a
we've-
type.
Which is a
yeah.
type. And
Right.
so I think he was, again, style is not permanent, but the sense of delight. I think the way he lifted the seating and then had you
Yeah.
come in under the seating makes for a very
And the
delightful.
acoustic is excellent.
And the acoustics, I saw Aorta and Flora Parim, the Brazilians who are so good with rhythm stuff in that particular theater, and I could not believe how astounding every
Yeah, it is
marimba
an
sound
extremely-
was. So I
extremely
think
well.
you have to give it to him that he knew when to step back as well as when to project. I think Lapidus was a...
But most people would not even know probably that he... Yeah, I have a question for you, Deborah, because as we're speaking and I have that image in my head and now I'm like worried that I may not have the right architect. But is he the one who did that, what I thought was an incredible hotel in Puerto Rico where you would reach the beach with
Yes.
a...
Yes, that's
Yes, he's the
Lapidus.
one, right?
Yes, that's the Conquistador.
Yeah, which I thought was the ultimate theater,
Yeah.
you know, where
I-
you would
I
actually go down
I
the beach
visited
in this sort of funiculare, like
Yeah,
this
a
sort of
funicular.
right.
It
He did that. Is that still? Is that building still?
I
It's
wanted
Still
to-
there,
Is
but
it
it's
still
been
functioning?
It's
you
been
think
transformed.
Well, because
It's
we're
been-
giving stories, I'll tell
But
you.
that was a theatrical thing. To go to the
fabulous.
beach as a train, you
Yes.
know.
Everything to it was fabulous. But we did take a cruise, Lapidus and I. We did a farewell to the island cruise that I've never spoken about. But one of the pictures is on the wall where he's sleeping. But Lapidus and I went there and it had been completely redone. Obviously, it was not the same. He stood at the balustrade and cried. I mean, of course, because, you know, and he couldn't really hide that he was really crying, that this
Yeah.
was a moment that, you know, was not his anymore. And it had already ended. And we were sad to leave it the way that we left it. It was not the same. So it was now, I think a Japanese firm bought it, and they had bougainvillea everywhere, and they made it a Spanish Mediterranean style.
Oh. So that's
You know, it's
interesting
in-
because
interesting.
here in Miami, his buildings have not been changed that much. I mean,
Well, the ones
sometimes
in
they've
Miami
been,
Beach,
you know.
the ones in Miami Beach, the Americana was demolished.
Americanas were demolished. But overall, I mean, I always something that I always thought was interesting with Lapidus is probably his relationship to climate, for example. On the one hand, you could say the Fontainebleau is not the most ecologically designed project regarding climate. But at the same time, there's these beautiful buildings, the one on the corner of Meridian and 17th, right
Yes.
across from Macy's, right? Which
That was his
has
office
this
building.
beautiful bronze Brise Soleil,
Right.
and there is the other one on Flagler Street,
one on Flagler.
right?
Yes.
Which are
There's
really
two.
quite unique. Not very many people in Miami ever did that type of solar protection in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Or late 50s or the 60s. And those buildings still stand,
Yes.
actually, as really good examples of what you would show your students today.
Yes.
This is a way of being, you know.
Well,
And
that
haven't
was
been
his
changed
office
that much.
building too,
Right.
right? And
That reminds me, though, of a conversation at one of those Kiwanis Club luncheons where Norman and Morris, and I was a bird on somebody's shoulder, we were talking about preservation and architectural preservation. And neither one of them were rabid about preserving their buildings or preserving buildings in general. They both concluded that buildings have lives like we have lives, and they serve their purpose, they serve their function, and they come to the ends of their lives sometimes too. Not that it's a happy moment when the Americana is torn down, or my father was a diplomat. He wouldn't go see it demolished. He was invited to see it, but these are their babies, and
Yeah.
but they also recognize that not every building is worth saving. That we ought to go down the path of selecting what best represents an era or a building or a neighborhood, but we don't have to save everything in the neighborhood.
But
An
you know, in
interesting
Miami,
discussion.
I would a little bit I would be careful because there's, you know, for example, why did an architectonica try to save the Pavilion? You know, and sometimes you
Right.
could say, well, because if you get bad with the city of Miami and you have new projects to build, maybe it's better to lose one to build others. And you know, so you have the case of Candela, Hilario Candela, who's been really vocal, but it doesn't matter to him, right? I mean, eventually, his career is already done. So, because sometimes you can see, you know, is that argument an argument that is really related to the philosophy, or is it also related? That's the smart thing to do, not to oppose the destruction of your art.
But I think they also came of age in an era where
Yeah, it's
art,
an age, and
you know,
it's a
before preservation was a thing,
exactly,
right?
it's a period. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
Lapidus would say, I'm not a strict preservationist, but the people use my buildings, they like them, they're functional, okay, they're going to be saved. And he liked it that they were so many of them that were still in his world that he had adopted. He'd come down here in the 50s, and he came down as an empty nester. His 2 children had left. He's retiring with his wife, really retiring. You come down, you start with the Fontainebleau, and where do you go? This isn't retirement. This is now 30 years full on practicing architecture, doing, I mean, the drive to do it as an empty nester, as like his children have left. Lapidus was quite special in that way, in that the burden of children was already gone, and he could indeed really be his own man. And I think the degree to which his buildings have been used and loved and shows how much he was a part of the community life. He did churches, he did synagogues, he did funeral homes, he did fire stations, he did theaters, he did Lincoln Road. He was a part of the web and the weave of the fabric of the community. And I don't think that people really get the fact that this man was building. He would say 90% of your lives are spent in architecture, in places that are designed by architects. Give the people a lift.
And by the way, I mean...
And so I think we owe a lot more to the Lapidus effect in terms of the overall effect. Not that he would look at one being more precious than the other, but that the overall fabric of Lapidus in our community is very much with us. If there's a building right now that they're discussing, it's the neighborhood center on 6th Street that they would like to save. And that's something that people really should look at, because although it's not a star building, maybe it does add to that community something very special. And is it still functioning in the same way? That would be a good study to see. But he would not go around and pointedly say, but he would go around pointedly say, I loved working with those people. This is what we did. Like for the Conquistador, he said, that was the ostrich man. Let me tell you about the ostrich man. He knew all of the people that he worked with.
Oh, yeah.
And he loved
And he loved talking about it.
and he loved talking about the people he had built these buildings for. They were not just his architectonic, empty-souled babies. These were buildings with souls of the people that had breathed life into it with him. These are Pygmalion experiences that Lapidus would birth with the client, and in a way that was really something that he enjoyed talking about. Even when he had to take a stick after.
Thinking the same story.
See, tell us the story about Novak.
Let's actually praise his clients too. I mean, because
that's exactly
you know,
what
even
I'm
though
trying to
we can say some of those clients were probably a little bit on the boastful, obnoxious side. I mean, you need a lot of guts to actually get the Fontainebleau being built,
Right.
you know, because for me, I still see that when I see the old pictures of the Fontainebleau, the original configuration, the structure of the hotel, the cabanas S structure, and the classical gardens with the pool, it is genial. I mean, it's a genial combination. Let's be say, from the point of view of architectural composition, if you draw this thing in 2D or maybe 3D, but let's just draw it in 3D, in 2D. You draw all those lines and you don't say it's the Fontainebleau. I'm sure the people would look at that and say, this is a very interesting composition.
But
right?
you know,
I would.
He delivered for the clients, though. I think that was that they gave him the space to do those things because he made it work.
Did they
Like
give him the space, or did he take the space?
well, maybe, but
Well,
his
what do
buildings
we-
were so
Well,
successful
that's
in
the
terms
secret,
of
right?
they were financial machines. I mean,
Yes.
the hotels, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there was the joke about the Fontainebleau that I don't know if it was Polly Redford said. Never has so much gross national product been assembled in one place.
That's right.
Like the shops, the ballrooms, the restaurants, the bars. He wove it all together and he multiplied the effect of it. It's the fourth wall of the economy.
That's right,
Of
the
a hotel.
economy was.
So of course, and probably they didn't read the drawings, but they trusted him that he was making the
Well,
spaces that
If you
he.
hear him talk about Ben Novak, there wasn't a whole lot of trust there, and at one point he went after Ben Novak with a 2x4 when he didn't pay his bill.
Well, yeah, and this was one project, one client only. You see with Mr. Lapidus's projects and client list that I have that he was helping the Muss family from the very beginning, Alexander Muss. He was working with the Tisch
right.
family from the very, very beginning, the very first hotels for these dynasties. The Musses, the Tisches, and
the Sofers.
And the Sofers, I was about to say, and with Aventura. He's not, many times he's not noted. Arthur Levine, who did all of the Arlen properties, was the one that introduced, that combined with Sofers. So Arlen, too, was another. These were dynastic families that still live today, basing their wealth and on the trust of that client-architect relationship that, the fourth wall of the economy. Lapidus delivered in spades. And I think there was only one time, and now that we're opening this up and we're going to talk about the Americana in a minute, the Americana was an interesting project for Lapidus because he had done the Fontainebleau, successful. Eden Rock, he had gone on a journey to France and Italy. He'd gone shopping. He was on a shopping spree, bringing everything back so that Eden Rock is more pure and more refined because now he's not getting it from the streets of New York, all that interior schlock and business. He's actually, he's actually.
He went to Italy.
I mean, now he's actually in Italy picking out, the tile in Sorrento, and he's going and seeing the bronze sculptures in the foundries. I mean, he's actually hand-picking around the world the parts that are going to go into the Eden Rock, which make it a level up. But Mufson wanted it a level up because he wanted to outdo Mufson. Novak. So Mufson, the spite between these two men, Lapidus would say, I got involved in this searing hate that I didn't know I was unwittingly being lured into. Right. This searing hate, that's what he called it. So, I mean, you have Lapidus being paid to go to Europe for the first time with his wife and paid to go shopping because Jules was making this a PR scam for everybody so that the whole year building up to it opening, the Fontainebleau was there, and then all these articles about Lapidus in Europe, Lapidus shopping, Lapidus here, and all of it coming back to the Eden Rock, right? I mean, fabulous. Okay, so then he gets, all this jam is going in and the public is loving Lapidus. The Tisches give him a call and they say, we're coming down from Laurel and the Pines.
Another dynastic family.
Right, and we're coming down from the Laurel and the Pines, and we want you to be our architect. And so he says, great, I've got the Tisches. This will be wonderful. And he goes away to do these shopping trips, right? Mm-hmm. And he lets the brilliant designer at his drafting table design the building. And he comes back the day before the meeting with the Tisches, and he looks at it, and he looks at it, and looks at it, and he goes, okay, I got it. He goes to meet with the Tisches and rolls out, and he explains the building. And then the Tisches sit there, and they say, thank you, Morris. And then silence. They said, that's enough. We've seen enough. And he walked out the door. And he was a little shocked. And he said, I wonder what just happened. And they called him a few days later, and they said, Morris, we've decided that we don't want you to be our architect. And so they said, we're taking back we'll pay you for what you have done, but we're taking back the contract. And Morris drove to their office, and he said, I tell you what, I'll forfeit my fee if you tell me why you're not hiring me. I'll forfeit any money. Just tell me why you're not using me. And the Tisches said, we wanted Lapidus, and this isn't Lapidus.
I see. Yeah.
And so in the end, he said, if you give me 5 days, I'll stay at the desk and I'll deliver Lapidus. And now I would like for Allan to talk about what he thinks about Lapidus at the Americana, because we've talked about this many times as being Lapidus's great signature piece that is not with us, but was a great signature piece.
Well, I don't know where he hit on the Americana theme. I don't know if the Tisches brought that or if he brought it. I'm guessing Lapidus brought it because it's...
The Americana theme, if I can tell you, in 1929, the "Oh Brother, Can You Spare a Dime" was the song that every Jewish boy knew because it was in the review of the play, The Americana. Oh. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?
Oh.
Mm-hmm. The most popular song in the world. What would the Tisches do? They would have known that. Lapidus would have known that, and they all wanted that feeling.
Yes. Well, that makes sense. But what's amazing about that theme is that theme strikes deeper, I think, than his other themes did, right? The French theme, the Italian theme, okay. But with the Pan-American theme, I think he hit on material that could take him much farther. And partially it's because he could bring in Brazilian modernism. He could connect to places throughout the Americas. It was a theme that was kind of natural in Miami, right? It was a tropical. It had tropical intonations.
Natural but unexplored.
Yes.
Yes,
unexplored until
totally unexplored.
That moment.
North-south instead of east-west. So it was kind of a breakaway of the moment, a breakaway moment.
You said you mentioned Niemeyer earlier.
Well,
That's where
Right, yeah.
That's where a lot of that came from.
Yeah.
Well, he visited Niemeyer when he was in between the shopping trips. B always wanted to travel, and they have family. Half of Lapidus's family is in South America.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So the Benderskis of Lapidus's family line and the Lapiduses that were there are all rancheros and gauchos. There's pictures on the wall. And so...
And that's one of the themes.
One of the themes for Lapidus's life was always that the brothers came to be together at Ellis Island and had to separate because of a bad eye condition of one of the brothers who said, "I'll go south." And so for Lapidus, it was the most bittersweet parting of family. And so as soon as he was able to have enough wealth and money, he went with his family to meet his southern family. He had gone as a child to meet his southern family with his family on a ship as well.
In Brazil?
Yes, in Brazil.
And I think for Jewish Americans, that north-south theme must have resonated also because east-west was Europe, and Europe was the old country, right?
And they didn't want anything from Europe. You're
Right. But then, the hotel also just had some marvelous moments. I mean, the lobby with the terrarium where he captured a piece of some idealized American landscape. I don't know if it was tropical or if it was just imaginary. Knowing Lapidus, it could have just been imaginary, but it was an amazing space. And he, there he really also took the cabanas to another level, right? Because every hotel in Miami Beach at a certain point had all the oceanfront ones had cabana colonies, but Lapidus turned them into really what then Philippe Starck would later reproduce at the Delano, which is living units that were cabanas, right? And he turned them into a way of life in a sense, and I think that's really interesting. It's a very innovative build. The actual towers were not that extraordinary. They were slab building, a little bit like the Aruba Hotel, like more or less slab buildings.
What he did with the balconies,
the balconies were phenomenal.
Oh, that's true.
Yes. Phenomenal.
The direction of the open terracotta, that was very interesting.
And also even to the garage that he had these plated aluminum that was being used to make the screens. He was very good with sunscreens, but he tried the first one at the Americana.
At the Americana,
because at the Americana in the garage area, they had that plated aluminum that gets crimpled and creased.
Yes.
And I had one of those pieces, and it's gone now, but it was amazing to touch it because it was something very Frank Lloyd Wright-ish in its own, like the DNA of it was something like you would imagine seeing at a Houstonian block or something like that. It had all of Lapidus in it, and it was one little piece.
And you have the mosaic tile, or you've
yes,
saved them.
Everybody asks about them, so we can talk about them now if you want. The Americana was desecrated, as Lapidus would call it. The interiors had been destroyed. Lapidus saw the Americana as his Art in Public Places expose. He had 25 artists from all over the world do the most incredible things. The elevators had enamel that was done by a woman from Belgium. You have a woman that was doing lamps out of ceramics, and she was from I have all of them listed somewhere. You had a man doing like almost Remington statuary. You had Lapidus doing his own fiberglass swirls of color and doing chairs that had the gaucho room, right? In the gaucho room. He had chairs that always had some sort of hide on them, and then the horns of the cow where you put your... So these, I mean, he had these artists, and he was blending with 25 different artists, and Anton Raffaget was one of them. And Anton was coming just then from a project in California where he had done the Reichshahn Center. And at the Reichshahn Center, he did the history of California. And so he said to Anton, have at it. And he's a fellow Russian. You can imagine them sitting with vodka talking about this particular room over a toss of vodka or a bottle of vodka, because these were 3 feet wide, 22 feet tall, and they were 12 of them that were flanking the 6 on each side, and it was the entrance to the Balmosque Ballroom. And in the Balmosque Ballroom, Anton would continue with the theme of Mardi Gras, and he would do different murals along the wall for the Mardi Gras theme from all the different islands. So Lapidus must have just had fun with this lobby with Anton.
Yeah. And these figures are the heroes of the Americas,
and
right?
they're the heroes.
Yeah,
Well, you
exactly.
have, it was a story of the
Toussaint
history.
Louverture and
It was the history of the
George Washington.
There's George Washington. The statesmen are on one side, and then you have the explorers on the other side. And so I
Today
remember
that would be very politically incorrect.
today it would. Well, that's exactly the point. Is that we're finding a very hard time to restore them because they're terribly politically incorrect. Because you start with Christopher Columbus, it's terrible.
Right. Yeah.
But back then it was something.
Exactly.
So
It was a storytelling.
It was storytelling.
But that's not why it was demolished. That's not why it was demolished.
No, it was not demolished because
It's the opposite
of this.
way,
It
in
was-
fact. It's interesting that
those were found, by
the
the way.
Latin American or
But
the American team
wait,
is
Fran-
the most demolished of all his buildings. I find it interesting also.
Well,
But maybe less value than the rest.
Did he
right?
do the interiors as well?
He did
Or did he do part of it? He didn't have the full total design as he had in the fountain room.
No, but he did this atrium, and the atrium had already been destroyed. They had already taken down all the statesmen's had already been removed. Lapidus did not even want to go into the building anymore.
Yeah,
He
it
felt
was
like it had,
terrible.
like the soul of it, the art of it had already left the building a long time ago, because he really loved the work of these artists. So we would go to Bal Harbor, but we would not go into that building. And so he particularly thought it was a waste of what he had started. So I think, Francois, that is the...
But I wanted to ask you a question because about Aventura.
Yes.
So
Want me to go back to that slide?
yeah. Can you, because it looks like it has like a quite amazing urban, if I dare call it urban, but was he really? Because I had always been looking for who actually designed at least the original idea
Me
of
too.
Aventura.
Yeah.
And then you tell
That's
us
it.
it's actually in his archives.
It is.
So,
That is
but
in-
how far did he go? Was it
Well,
just
he
a
did
concept? or-
No, he built them. He did 17 projects. The crab buildings are his. The El Dorado is his. These are his buildings.
But what about the plan? I mean, if
And
they,
these are plans that were done of those projects. Yes, all the
and
plans.
also the
And
urban
site
plan.
planning.
The planning was also done by him.
Yes. The original plan was done by a man in San Francisco. He was asked to look at it by Arthur Levine, who he had just done the Arlen properties with. The Arlen properties were already very successful, and he thought very much, again, a very good client architect relationship is what we're building here, this trust. And so Arlen said, look at what I have, and Lapidus said it won't work for Florida. This won't be something for us. But he did use the original A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I think.
Yeah.
He used it A through F. I think that's about all that was kept from the guy in California, the original one.
Because then in the planning,
and I think
then in the planning, when you look at the drawing, I mean, the drawing was quickly on the screen, but the planning of the project, if that's what I saw on the screen, it's unique. It has unique formal qualities that we know what Aventura looks like. It probably has been messed up a lot from the original. So it actually had a somewhat connection to the Interrama place as well, as you mentioned. The Interrama, it's interesting because that, you know, Allan told me that we just talked about Interrama, and you told him, well, actually Lapidus did a project for Interrama. It's actually in the early 70s version, but that rendering, I had seen it. I had seen it probably after we did the exhibition, but I had seen that rendering, and I had seen a note on Interrama, but there wasn't the name of the architect. And so I actually said, no, it's probably not Interrama, because we would have seen it when we did the exhibition.
Well, do you
but
want
it's
me
a
to...
really, it's a really interesting.
So let me go to that slide.
I mean, the combination of that sort of Diabolo form
why it wasn't in the record.
with the sort of outside structure. Yeah, maybe we turn the light for a second. If we turn the light for a second, maybe we could see it. I had seen that image, but I had no clue that it was actually an Interrama play. So this is probably the latest phase, which is after 1970, when more Miami architects get involved, like also...
this was before
This
that.
is from 1965.
This is earlier.
This is
earlier.
65.
I think this predates the late 1960s version. And it may have been
before Kahn and all of those guys came into the play? You think
Because there was a concept in the late 50s, they started talking about a trade center, a permanent international fair.
Right.
And that idea had been around for a while. And then it lingered, and then in the mid-60s is when the Kahn plan came about.
Yeah, because of Cuba and all of those things. But what's interesting is, as Allan, I think, mentioned, is that we did a huge exhibition. We investigated so many things. We read so many things. Never did we see his name in anything about the project. And so when I saw the project, I didn't know it was his.
Well, I don't think I don't know that it was for the competition. We know that it was
predated
for
it.
It was the
predated
World's
it,
Fair
probably.
in Florida,
So
is how he writes about it.
Right.
So I don't think that it was per se the exact same project that...
No, it is
You
because
looked at the archives of the Interrama
It's the
Authority.
same site.
This predated that whole authority, that whole notion.
This was an
10
international
years
trade
earlier.
center.
Yeah,
on
but that's
the
still considered, because if you go to the Syracuse understood it. They actually put this project in two places: the Inter-American Trade Center and Interrama. It's actually the same thing. It's just one that actually just was transformed into the other one. So this probably, you're right. The word Interrama comes a little later than the original piece. But eventually it's the same idea.
This ties into the story of his place within the world of architects, I think, because you know, the first Interrama, the 1950s, with Alfred Browning Parker and I don't know, Robert Fitch Smith, and that was probably the elite of Miami architects, right? Working on those guys, and Lapidus, as a Jewish, commercially, oriented architect, probably wasn't invited, right?
No, and a newcomer to Miami.
And a newcomer.
Yeah, and a newcomer to Miami. Yes. And then in the later version, which was Kahn and Breuer and Rudolph and everything, he wasn't in that club either, right? No. He was not in that, but he was probably in working with local developers who had ideas, and maybe in that phase between the two phases of Interrama that we were looking at, Jean-François, maybe one of them came forward with this project. I could easily imagine that happening. Right?
No, I mean, it's certainly as interesting as anything else that was dug out about the Interrama project, the 20 years.
Right.
The 20-year saga, basically.
Well, I want to show you the one
show
slide.
The Interrama. Show the yeah, look at this.
Yeah.
This is
Look at that
fabulous.
landmass of the Aventura. Are these really like islands of sort of the?
Well,
like-
yes. Lapidus said that at this particular time, the engineering was very complicated because of it being a swamp. You know, mat foundations were just being developed. It was
For so
skipped
many
over
years.
for
Yeah.
so many years, and
Yes.
even everybody thought, so for what is he
Right.
thinking? And even his own family thought, what are you thinking? So he brought in the partners so that he would be able to have the money to go forward. So I think it's a very interesting story. He particularly liked the little crab buildings. He calls them crabs because you see the shape of them. And then he liked the fact that he had so many, I'll just read what he wrote. This is directly from his manual, from his office press. My office was responsible for all
Oh,
the
I see
original
what you-
site planning and for all the housing on the site. The project included a great waterway which bisects the site. There are several types of housing projects, from the townhouses known as the Villa Dorada townhouses through the mid-rise complex known as the Ensenada and the high-rise complex known as Bravura. The total project was designed to contain 18,000 dwelling units in a complex of buildings of different heights, different shapes, and different clusters. The names of the buildings come from the original designation on the various sites, ranging from A through F.
Interesting.
Wow.
That's really interesting. No, I had no idea.
You're right that it's unique. Well, it's unique in Miami, I think, certainly, and it introduces probably for the first time a type of planning that we didn't really have here, right? Where everything very zoned and clustered, and where there's a shopping center as part of the anchor of the town. I mean, it's quite unusual.
Well, compare this to Miami Lakes. Developments were contemporary.
Contemporary, exactly.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
very
That's a
different
great.
forms.
That's very true.
It's
But-
kind of a Miami Ville radieuse, right? I mean,
Yeah.
But you know, it is a good question because Miami, if anything, it exports urbanism through the University of Miami. And this as a study is a very interesting idea about a different type of urbanism. And I do think it gives somebody an idea of what he was thinking. And he did go on to do other projects like this, like the Crescent and the Villages for Trump, which are still successful. He did design the Villages for Donald Trump's father, Fred. So, I mean, Fred Trump was actually one of his clients for at least 15 projects that I have on my client list. Trump came to him, and the Villages is one. And he met him through a lobby. The lobby of the Sanssouci was what brought Fred Trump to him. And he said, I like what you did at the lobby. Can you come do that to one of my lobbies? And then from the lobby, it went on to being little shopping centers. And then from the shopping centers, it grew into becoming the Villages.
Well, he was always on the edge of new things, right? I'm
Oh
sorry,
yeah, I mean, if you look at it, Lapidus was very spatial. He was very special, and people trusted him. And again, he was an older man with 22 years of store design, selling merchandise in store designs, and he had finally sold the ultimate thing, which was an architect's trust.
I mean, he picked up on Victor Gruen's idea of the pedestrian mall, but made the most successful one
Well, you know,
out of it, right? in a
What's
sense.
interesting about Victor Gruen is that Abby Harrell, who was Morris's top man, and this goes full circle, Morris invented Abby Harrell, he said, because Abby came back with post-traumatic stress syndrome from one of the wars, and the mother threw him at Lapidus and said, please, please take my son. And he turned Abby into his top man. And Abby, in one night of falling in love with a woman and leaving, went to work with Victor Gruen. Chased a woman to California. So these are fun stories because then Victor Gruen has all the DNA of Lapidus
Yes.
in his office.
Yeah.
And like you say, the transferring of the DNA.
Yeah.
And so here is now Victor Gruen sampling every single thing that Lapidus had done, and up to that, even the Lincoln Road. So it's very
It's
interesting.
I commented to you before we started talking about the commercial buildings. I looked at your book last night, thumbed through it again, and so many of the early stores in New York had what we see in the hotels and many other buildings in the 50s and the early 60s, where the building became part of the signage, and the signage became part of the building, and it gave a sense of identity. It was a very common architectural vernacular, not limited to Morris, but many architects here in South Florida were using it and continued to use it. And the thought that hit me last night was, where did we change the zoning on Miami Beach to get rid of the signage as part of the architecture to say, oh no, you got to have 12-inch high letters and you can only be 10 feet long, and that's it. And as I was driving here tonight, I passed by Burdine's Macy's, and it was such an iconic element. And I regret that we've changed the zoning and banished that style. It gave the buildings interest.
Yeah,
We've got a lot of boxes coming up that are not terribly interesting, that a little bit of neon, a little bit of sign would at least give them a little more flair.
It's interesting that on the Lincoln Road extension between, I think, Washington and Collins, the Miami Beach Planning Department went out of its way to really try to blow it up. I think Tom Mooney at one point said it's almost like our mini Times Square. You notice the huge neon CVS and surf style and so forth. It's reverse of everything else in Miami Beach, and it's really kind of fun.
Well, it's part of our heritage. We don't think sometimes when we change some of the zoning factors that we don't appreciate its full impact. We're a city of automobiles that in the last 10 years has had a planning commitment to let's be pedestrian, let's be bicycle. We've taken away hundreds of parking spaces. You can't park here in South Beach, not because there's no parking. There's no parking because the city, by changing the zoning, eliminated it. We take major streets, Collins Avenue, Meridian Avenue, Alton Road, and we suddenly say, these are our major arteries, but let's put bikes on there, let's put pedestrians on there. We need to segregate them and step back a bit.
Can I ask that we...
There's a rendering we were looking at before we started of Lincoln Road.
Yeah, can we look at this slide for just a second? I think this sums up what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The nightlife of Miami is another life all in its own, and I do agree that a lot of the MiMo experience was driving. And you would go through the city and see the buildings. So as soon as we break the artery and the ability to drive and see our buildings from our window shield, we're losing a part of that original experience. The 50s was a car-dominant experience.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And if we want to continue being dominated by the beauty of our buildings, we have to be very careful that we don't lose the ride that we share with our buildings, because the streets become their front door, become the red carpet for those buildings. And even if we want to change the size of the streets and change what the flavor of the streets, the access to the streets becomes a bloodline for the visual experience that is indeed what makes the memory of a place. So every time you change that visual experience, every time that serial expression of space changes, now that place is different.
Yes.
So if we're not seeing it anymore, we're not experiencing it anymore, and it is lost from our mental DNA as well.
Do you have the slide of Lincoln Road Mall that we were looking at earlier? With the bridges?
I have one of, I don't have that one here.
It's not in here.
What I was trying to, but we were talking about, it's not in this set, I don't think. We're talking earlier.
Right on the other side of the wall there is the rendering of Lincoln Road. And interestingly enough, at Pennsylvania Avenue and at Meridian Avenue, there were bridges separating the cars from the pedestrians. The mall, in effect, went underneath.
And the bridges were considered too extreme at the time, and they were many of his ideas that show up in his original rendering, which he drew it all himself. Many of his original ideas were erased from the project. We're lucky that we have the concrete follies that we have.
Well, we had some other. There were some the great. Somebody who's completely ignored, also forgotten in Miami is Doxiadis, right? Who, the Greek, really very important Greek international planner who I think it's 1967, made a master plan for downtown Miami where he actually proposed to cover Biscayne Boulevard and to bring the park all the way and then eventually have the park reconnect to the city streets through a series of staircases with an absolutely fabulous really very interesting sections, which would have changed dramatically the relationship between Miami and its waterfront. I mean, there are a lot of people like that, you know, that have been. That's why it's so. I mean, eventually Lapidus had his revenge, right? He was criticized in those years. But it's also interesting to remember that even somebody like Niemeyer was actually heavily criticized in the American architectural press as well after '55. There is the two exhibitions at MoMA. There is the exhibition that is architecture until 1945, which is taking place during the Second World War, and which actually praises the whole experiment of Latin American architecture. And then there is the exhibition of 45-55, which is a totally different spirit. And not necessarily from MoMA, they just want to continue, they just continue the presentation, but the criticism of that second exposition by the same people who actually criticized Lapidus was radical. They thought it was a complete treason of modernism. And so because of the curves, so the curves worked well during the Second World War. Once the American enterprise machine and the American architectural machine had restarted, you know, the sort of the New York, you know, the New York of Tower. Everything that was curved was absolutely disconsidered. And the Summit Hotel by Lapidus was equally disdained, in part because of the Latin American decoration, right?
And because of the curves.
Well,
because of the curves and some of the stuff that he had put inside, which in New York, in the Nets, you know, showing Latin America was okay in West Side Story, but you know, putting it in an hotel was was a very different story. Not particularly a very correct period, all right? And it's just
that building and
because you mentioned that earlier.
Well, the comment you're making is, let's have no more snake dances on Lexington.
Yes.
That was the article for the summit. And
exactly.
so,
you know,
and even when
that was pretty racist.
And when Arquitectonica did their did the West End, which was one of the projects I worked on with them. When they did that, the press came out with, we need no more salsa.
Exactly. No more salsa.
So
exactly.
you know, we don't
really
need the
amazing.
salsa because
amazing.
So
it was also we'll take your pompano and oranges, but keep your architects to yourself.
That's right. That's right. Well, so I think it's a very interesting study, not about the architecture type, but about the Miami as a place being perceived in the architectural tradition.
Exactly.
So it's something that we know that Miami exports urbanism. We've given urbanism, you folks have given urbanism to the world and given it a new twist. Now we export the architecture and it's still being called a tango. So we still have a mixed, how do you say, a mixed reception.
Yeah, it's a north-south.
It's a north-south thing. So I think there's still plenty to speak about. Lapidus, I think, in this manner, going further south and meeting Niemeyer, going and meeting Oscar, Alvar Aalto, seeing Gio Ponte, he was making an argument for organic architecture in a way, saying that this was a branch of architecture that had been missed and that he felt resonated with him. And so I think that the study of organic architecture and placing Lapidus within that conversation certainly would not hurt to give him a little bit more of how do you say, a dimension outside of just what he was doing here, and that cross-dimensioning academically would be very important, I think.
Yeah,
and as well as some of the urbanism that he did, which is more organic than what you see as a developer's programmatic site planning. Even in Chalk House, at the Villages, at Aventura, at some of his other projects show a great understanding of site planning and the relationship. I'm thinking of the hotel that he did in Aruba. The goats were all over the place and they were such a problem. What did he do? He planted rows of cactus all around the building. Why? The goats didn't go past the cactus. So, I mean, these are simple stories. But I mean, that sounds almost too
better
simple.
than a wall of concrete, right?
Sounds a little mean.
I mean, but he brought in all of the worn. There's the posada and the wind that constantly comes in Aruba. It drops everything down, so he lifts the building up by 4 floors so it doesn't feel the wind. and the building is up by 4 floors with a pool underneath the building, and then you have these massive rocks in the front, and the driveway has to sweep up
Yes,
so
that
that
was
you're
nice.
outside of the wind
Yeah.
of that's at the level of the ground. These were all very interesting dynamics that when Lapidus left Miami's shore, he took with him Aruba, Jamaica, come on pretty baby. You wouldn't have the phenomenon of the islands if you had not had Lapidus going down there first to Aruba and first to Jamaica and sprinkling in these resort destinations that later he would build the very cruise ships that would use those destinations. So this is a very fascinating story of a man that has created an incredible
So,
cycle,
circuit.
A question.
an incredible circuit. Because when Aronson, he went into Aronson's office and Aronson said, "What do you see, Lapidus, out of my window?" And Morris said, "Water." And he said, "I see real estate."
That's a real Miami quotation, a real Miami quote.
"I see real estate. Give it up." And Lapidus said, "I get it."
Yeah.
Sure, that
You know, and he started
Yeah.
these floating cities.
And they are. That's a very Miami story, these cruise ships, right? They're
Yes.
basically the next generation of hotels like the Fontainebleau. I mean,
Exactly.
they just figured out a way to put it on a hull
Right,
and float
and-
it and sail it around.
And it's a phenomenal thing, right?
Yeah, it is.
I wish
Ted
Lapidus would have
Harrison.
designed a cruise ship. No,
He
didn't.
did, and he did the
did.
one in 1943
Three,
for
yeah.
Etna.
Yes,
and,
but
and
that.
it was, but he
But,
did
yeah,
design 3
because
cruise
he would have
ships.
been probably a quite interesting.
Well, he did
But he
3
did
ships.
3
For
ships.
the first 3 ships for Carnival Cruise
He
Lines.
did the
Yeah.
Carnival, the Mardi Gras, and one of the other ones. They've just reintroduced the Mardi Gras
I
this
didn't know
April.
that.
And
He's
so
done so
with the
many
new
things
Mardi
at the
Gras
end, you-
coming
you
out, that
lose-
really
you
plays
lose track.
homage back to the very first one done by Lapidus with
And
Aronson.
to work with Ted Harrison was special.
It must
Ted
have been.
Harrison, I sat with him when we were trying to redevelop Miami Beach in 1984, 85, when things were bad. And he sat around the table and he said, "Come, let us dream together." And that stuck with me the rest of my life. It was just, in that one sentence, he captured where Miami was going in the next 30 years.
That's right. And Dodge Island is a very interesting story. If we have a minute, the man that they built Dodge Island for is a man named Alvin Chester. And Alvin had, it's very interesting. Morris was 95, Alvin was 92. And I met his companion and I said, we should all have dinner. And we had dinner, and they would talk. And what did they talk about? 42nd Street. Because Alvin had just come back from the Philippines, saving all the men in the Philippines, and he's sitting at the desk, sharpening pencils, trying to figure out, what am I going to do? And then finally he hit on the idea that I'm going to turn warships into, what do you call these? The ships that are there now. It's the storage ships, not storage, but the
Cargo
actual
container.
cargo.
Cargo,
Yes,
yeah.
the cargo ships. So he turns it into cargo ships and he starts bringing tuna out of South America. And 42nd Street. When they wanted the business down here for Dodge Island, they brought Alvin down with all of his shipping knowledge and with his liners that he had, and they began with Blackburn, Roddard, and Chester. So that was the beginning of Dodge Island for that. It was interesting to see it went from from those tankers to all of the fleets of ships that brought goods from the south and from all over to then being passenger ships out. It's been an interesting cycle that happened from 70-ish when Dodge Island was built to the
60s.
The 60s.
The late 60s.
Late 60s, and then with 73 with the Carnival. So this is in our recent, like 60-year history. It's during our lifetime that we could see those I guess, businesses evolve and come to age, really. But Lapidus was there at the beginning.
Yeah,
I wanted to ask you a question about what brought these 2 Germans to actually make a book about him. You know, the first book that was not by him, which is that, you know, that was one of the best books on his work. Do you know what's the story about why these 2 Germans that are relatively unknown? I mean, what caught their...
Well, what caught their eye probably was him being with, it was an architect and the architect's wife.
Yeah.
And so the wife was the one who really liked Lapidus's work. And she was the one that sought Lapidus out. more so
really?
than the wife. I mean, more so than the husband. And so she was the one that
Because
said
that's
we'd
really,
like
really
to do
quite
this.
interesting.
And Lapidus was always comfortable talking to women about his projects. I think that's very true too. I think Lapidus felt very good talking to women about anything, really, but particularly, if he-
you're the real.
I'm probably.
you're the-
I mean, Lapidus. I guess I'm obviously the evidence of that. But Lapidus didn't mind talking to a woman about, and he found her very agreeable. And so Martina and he had quite a dialogue that was struck up because I think of her interest in some of the projects that he had done, and particularly Lincoln Road. She fell in love with Lincoln Road as a public space.
Yeah.
Can I go back to a minute to the big signs? Because I totally agree with you that the post-war brought the spirit of the automobile and mobility and what could be visible from an automobile, right? But in 1939 at the World's Fair, when he does the pavilion, Morris Lapidus with Morris Sanders does a pavilion for the Distillers Association of America. I'm not sure that's the right name. The building has an enormous billboard. I mean, I don't know if you have it.
I'm trying to see if I can get you the distillery building. I think I have it somewhere. That's us.
It had a gigantic billboard, and this is
I'm
in the
trying
middle
to find
of a World's Fair, right?
Yeah.
And
I
I
had it.
think that Morris saw buildings in a way as billboards because
He
you know
did.
he
That's him telling
Well, you
the
saw it
story.
expressed so many times in the storefronts for the stores.
yeah.
Well, there's your distillery building and the friendship with the Brofmans, because he had done the Seagrams, all of their bars. This is the one for the Tudor-shaped bar, the Tudor bar for the offices, and in the Chrysler Building for them personally, for Sam to drink his drinks. He
You
wanted
see the
to,
Toledo Hotel lobby?
and then
Yes, exactly.
And then this is the more modern tasting room with the cheese holes, And then this was, I don't have the elevation, Alan, that you're talking about of the distillery building with the huge billboard, but it is exactly as you say, a huge billboard.
It was amazing because
It
it had
was
all
amazing.
the raw ingredients that are distilled.
All
It
the raw
had wheat and sugar cane
and rye.
just blown up to massive scale, 3 stories high and 100 feet long.
And it's a fabulous one. What I did instead was I put in his exhibit that he had
Yeah.
Oh,
at
yeah.
the end of his exhibit, which was on the other, which is here on the other page. I'm trying to find
No,
it.
it's- yeah, you just hit
okay.
it.
This is the model. Those are the exhibits at the bottom where what he had was little mannequin, little people, like little robots that actually brought the little kernels and dropped them into a bucket, and then the little bucket would then get motorized and get moved.
It was a train.
It
that
was a
went-
train. So what Morris was doing was selling the nation that the taxation base of liquor was going to put roads, schools, hospitals,
Right.
office buildings, every public good that you wanted in the planet was going to be paid on the base of our addictions to a
Exactly.
libation. And he was telling you, these libations are going to be powerful because they're going to build our nation and make us strong.
Interesting.
Liquor wasn't drinking or sociability, it was industry and commerce.
That's right, industry and commerce.
Yeah.
It was not drinking and sociability. This was,
Was that Morris or
This-
was that the Bromfords?
it was all
was
of them.
yeah.
These,
That's the problem.
you know,
It was
you
a
get-
client. It was a
listen,
client.
You had Hiram Walker, you had the Brofmans, and then you had the other guy that was doing the whiskey,
Well,
the
you had,
Bourbon family.
Shenley.
Yeah, Shenley, the-
Shenley and then Bacardi, which was with Shenley.
So Lapidus was always intrinsically tied to like the bars, the libation, that this is a public good. I mean, he did not feel bad about his bars. He was exuberant in his bars. In every hotel, you say, he did not lack at all to make people feel like they wanted to be there, needed to be there, and would spend time there and drink and
Spend money and then
And
help
spend-
the country. Yeah,
that's right,
a
and
nice.
and
It's a
contribute.
nice plan.
I mean, this was life for Lapidus, and he would say that 20% of some of the budgets for hotels were coming from the bars.
Oh, yeah. It's probably still that way.
Yeah.
Maybe more.
But he started doing speakeasies from the very at the very beginning. So this was a long life, and the distillery building. was really when he sold liquor to America, and I think he never winced about that. He thought that was a public good.
But it's interesting to think that he did it that way, while Mies van der Rohe was doing it for the Seagram, for the
Yes.
Bronfmans in another way, right?
Well, that's because Phyllis Brofman did not like Lapidus. He had already designed the rumpus room at the house, and she'd already dealt with how he had not put pink where she wanted it or whatever. And, you know, you have this child not liking the architect, and this is the beginning of the next generation, right? So
Yeah.
she's not.
Yeah,
she's,
Phyllis Lambert and Lapidus seems like an
No, it doesn't seem right.
impossibility.
No.
There's something.
Well, but it was also in the context of New York, and the New York architectural critics turned their nose up at Lapidus, so that was another reason to move
a
on.
very big reason, yeah. But Lapidus remembered Sam when he was bringing alcohol in from the barber shops. This was Prohibition, and when they were bringing it down the Charles River, you know, from Canada. This is a very interesting story. You know, Lapidus loved all those stories, and he knew them when they were just boys with alcohol in their pockets.
Yeah.
And
At
that
the
was just-
outside of the speakeasies. This is a very interesting life. You know, Lapidus lived through that.
And that was just 6 years before that,
It's 6 years before that.
right? Because Prohibition ended in 33.
Yeah.
And this is what, 39? Or
Yeah,
40?
39. So I think I'm getting the note from that we're ending and wrapping
Yes.
up. Did we miss anything, gentlemen, that you might want to?
No,
I can show the. Do you want us to run through? Do you want to turn the lights off and we'll run through these slides I put together? So, just to recap, Lapidus was a great storyteller, and this is him telling the story to our nation of the distillery building, and this is the connection with the Catskills and Miami Beach. Let's us please remember that Lapidus was for 10 years working between the two places before he launched this into the Bahamas. And then let's remember that in context with Morris, we have 8 of his important luxury, we have 8 important hotels, and we've also created a mid-century modern district that celebrates 8 of his important luxury apartment buildings.
Yeah,
And I
which
want to
are
say to
cool.
you that I know Lapidus would be very appreciative of all of our efforts to do this on his behalf. I
Yeah.
mean, I know he would be.
they built his apartment.
Let's not
building.
forget, people, that cars, roads, and neon make a MiMo experience, that if we want to continue the 50s, we have to continue this accessibility from our window shield as well. That cars, roads, and neon was, you can see here with Lapidus, he was totally at his element when he did the Delito. It's become more of a symbol than even a sign. It floats at night. It looks like a floating boat. I mean, it looks like a Venetian thing. Oh, the hubcaps too, and the circles are hubcaps. Excuse me, I forgot. But go ahead, Alan.
But the interplay between Lapidus and Polavitsky, which, you know, there was a connection there. They were both of Russian heritage, and you know, I knew it was the case at the Shelbourne where Polavitsky did the first building, Lapidus did the second building, and when I spoke, I did have a chance to ask Lapidus about that, and he said, I love that building. I love Polavitsky's building. I thought I just wanted to kind of do my own version of it, which he did. But at the Delito, he did something very different around another Polavitsky building. So there is these, and they're very different architects in character. But I just thought that's a great theme that could be.
Well, the Delito,
For another-
maybe we don't have time, but the Delito is an interesting and fascinating story. You can see the flagstone from the Town and Country still on the Lincoln Road side, and then if you know the original drawings, the Town and Country had a big circular canopy that came out like a boomerang, right? So there's like one arm of the boomerang. But if you go to the Collins Street, you see Lapidus has done homage to Polavitsky and has added the flagstone, and then it rips and it goes back. And
Yeah.
so you see 2 indications of flagstone, and you also see like this arm jutting out of it like Lapidus. It's almost like from one side to the other side, he's put parentheses around this whole place that this is together. He's kind of given arms to both of them with these canopies. And he's addressed the street in those 2 locations. And on this particular moment, he's tucked the entry to the underside so that those 2 brackets really hold the presence on the street.
Yeah.
It's a
It's
very
a beautiful
You know, it's
composition.
interesting, if you think about the context, here were buildings and additions put on buildings and how they worked so very successfully and having their own expression, but tying it all together. And you think about so many of the buildings that we've gone through in the last 15 years on the beach of where additions and towers have been added and how unsuccessful they've been.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lapidus
Exactly.
tried to,
Yeah,
you can
refusal
see an
to-
homage
The-
in
the
his
refusal
time.
of the-
And maybe you hit on it. There was a professional respect for what was there to begin with. And there was an effort to say, let's be a complementary team. Whereas today, you see so many of the buildings and it's, well, where did that come from? Or
Real estate.
You know, they're holding on to pieces of the original, but where's the new statement? Tie it all together.
Right.
And
That may
it's
come
really
from
missing.
academia. Let's teach our architects to be friendlier. Okay.
Adaptive use studios.
That's the,
Lapidus did a car never bought anything. I
so
think.
the model was lost, right?
I
Unfortunately.
mean, and so
What's
I
that?
thought
The
I
model
thought this
was
was
lost,
this was
right?
pretty.
Yeah,
This was
yeah.
his greatest moment of selling Lincoln Road. I think that was fabulous.
that model was like amazing.
The irony is the Seville was designed by his competitor, Mel Grossman.
That's right.
Yeah.
But a protege, too,
But he
right?
worked. He was a protege
No,
actually.
actually, Grossman was Albert Annis's nephew.
No, also Lapidus.
Yes.
He considers himself also a protege of Lapidus. He worked for both of them. Again, this cycle of architects and draftsmen going
Right.
between offices and cross-pollinating. Grossman actually considered himself a
He was,
protege
yeah,
of
he was
Lapidus.
a good guy too. Grossman was.
So at the entry renderings for Lincoln Road, Lapidus would be appalled at what we have today. I'm sure everybody loves those New Jersey, the Jersey walls, but this was his idea of a better Jersey wall. Okay, so this is how you would really do a Jersey wall.
Right.
Okay, and this is what they actually looked like when they were built. So this is like the better Jersey wall. If we wanted to do that, we should go back to these original
You gotta
drawings.
get rid of the roach.
And this could be the front entrance again if we wanted to go back and redo it. This is the entry.
Yeah.
And this was, it's interesting, 1959, we have the cars, then you have the road, and then you have Times Square repeating what we are with our black and white stripes, right? So and if you remember history enough, you can remember that Carl Fisher in 1920 put it's June in Miami with a bathing beauty on Times Square. So, I mean, if you go to Times Square, there is a place where the Lincoln Highway goes through, and then you have the Lincoln Tunnel, which connects, and the Lincoln Highway was Fisher's as well. So Lincoln Road was the second naming of something after Lincoln by the same man, Carl Fisher.
But I think Fisher wouldn't like the fact that his house was replaced
Oh,
by the
he-
Decoupage building.
I don't. So Morris Lapidus on Lincoln Road in 1998. I stood in for him, and I used that for my business card for 22 years now. That's probably the one time that the girl got a cameo. And so this is the first pedestrian mall in the country. Docomomo helped me in 2012, and we did put this on a National Registry of Historic Places, and we can claim a plaque for that, and we can pay for that, and we can have that put in if we want to. I have not finished, the application is finished. It was signed by Matty Bauer.
Yeah.
It was approved, and so we have that. It was preserved as the contributing features are the concrete structures, and it was national registered as a garden and as an incredible landscape for 100 years. Okay, there, and this is the Stair to Nowhere. Of course, he's in pop culture everywhere. Anybody see Miss Maisel? Anybody?
With Rome, with the
The
Forum
marvelous
Romanum.
Miss Maisel. You're right. And again,
Which is-
this goes back to your
Yeah, the
your scenographic architecture, right?
It's Rome, right? He
It's
knew.
Rome, right?
That's where it is invented, right? The Baroque.
This is his homage to Vitruvius.
It's homage to, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, you
this is his
mentioned-
homage to his, the light and the Vitruvian message, of beauty, right? This
Yeah,
is him saying,
exactly.
I made something beautiful, and I'm giving homage back to who I learned it from. He came over on a steamship when he was, coming out of Russia, and then he's on a steamship going south to see his family. Yes, he understood steamships, Alan, and I do think that Eden Rock is a part of that story with the balconies and
Yeah.
with the
Yeah, yeah.
with the top. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? That's where we get,
Yeah.
I believe, the Americana. And this was the original interior of the Americana. And this was it's actually interesting, all of those circular things you see are not necessary. They're really air conditioning vents. But
Yeah,
he-
but they're
but he
they're
would not
really-
have 5 or 10 or the randomness of it. So he put them all in a pattern. And in a way, that's like who was that? The architect, Maybeck, did that. Remember with
Yeah.
the first Church of the Christ scientists? He was the first one to put the air
Yes,
conditioning
that's,
in the column.
that's good architecture.
So
if you
this
can
is-
solve that problem, look here, right? It
Yeah.
needs some work here.
So I think you wanted to mention that the terrarium you think was his
Maybe we
great
need to hang
moment.
a
And
scene.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it was just an extraordinary space. I did get to go into it before it was demolished, but it was, of course, just a shell of itself.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing type of space also for Florida, I think. This
And that's
huge
what I mean with
elliptical
origin.
room.
It's his capacity to create real architectural space.
Yeah.
And there are not so many in this city.
Right.
All buildings can.
Not only was it an architectural space, but it was a space of tropical South Florida.
Sure.
You knew you were in Miami Beach. You were not in New York or Chicago or
Right.
Philadelphia.
And the colors are a lot more mundane, right? I mean,
Well,
they've become columns, pretty much.
Right,
yeah.
they become columns, but they have Aztec tiles on that
Yeah,
he
that's
designed.
like that, yeah.
And the actual
Would
glass and bronze
be-
piece that's hanging, Lapidus designed that.
When I
That
see
was-
these images, I
And it
really think about
layers.
Polavitsky in Cuba.
Exactly.
His main building there has this type
Yeah.
of combinations of art. Synthesis of the art, the idea of including the art in architecture is something that didn't really work that much in the US after the war, but it was very present in Latin America, extremely present in Latin America. He got a glimpse of that. He got a glimpse of that, which is pretty much the only one who really did it. I mean, we had the frescoes in the 1930s, but that's a totally different approach.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
really-
this hotel with the 25 artists, if you just a whole book could be done on just this project. Because those artists
and
were
the
phenomenal.
same on Polavitsky in Havana.
By the way, this is what we have left of it. This was when I was called and I said, okay, we found the mosaics, and this is what the mosaics look
Yeah,
like.
that's super cool.
And that art has been in Tallahassee for 10 years in storage, waiting to be restored. It could be brought back here for that matter, but as you said, it's politically incorrect. But the work of Anton Referget is amazing. It is absolutely amazing.
Really incredible.
And just to mention that he is a Smithsonian artist, just as Lapidus is, and Anton has 40 linear feet of boxes at the Smithsonian that
Really?
record his work at the radio. He used to wake up Diego Rivero to get him to come and do
Yeah,
work,
yeah.
So this connection is very strong. And so this art is very special if we look at it as art. We should not hate the fact that this is Blake, And yes, there was a father and son story. And it was a very big father and son story. And I think that Allan deserves credit in the later years for helping Lapidus open to so many styles. I think Allan was the one that was moving in that direction. Allan wrote a book, Everything by Design. I think it's a good enough book about his life. And he says how much he worked with Donald Trump, and he's very happy of his work with Donald Trump. And that was a legacy through his father. So I will just say that Fred, obviously, they were clients, and they had a good client relationship. I guess he did. I just wanted to mention that Morris did a lot of public planning of things. This is Robert Moses. He met him on the cruise to Brazil to see his family, and Robert Moses said, will you do Bedford-Stuy? And so Morris went back to where he grew up in Flatbush, and he did the Bedford-Stuy. He did the People's Place there for children. It's still there. It needs to be
It's nice.
restored. It needs to be preserved, but it's
Is it
fabulous.
it's still there.
It's still there, and it won awards for them. So the only other public place he did was Bedford-Stuy. So Lapidus, I was able to get him to the National Design Award. There he is as the American original. Here with Philip Johnson. You can tell by the glasses, otherwise it's a very fuzzy picture. Anyway, so that's me with Philip Johnson and Mr. Lapidus. And then this is Frank Gehry when they won the award together. In the end, both Johnson and Gehry actually came to appreciate and actually, you know, Philip Johnson had said about the architecture of the Fontainebleau, he's put 27 textures together, 20, you know, all these colors. I'm going to wait to have an answer about Lapidus. Anyway, in the end, Lapidus represents an idea, and I think it's an idea that we can have it all. And I think you can have it all, but you have to make sure you make good relationships along the way. And you have to remember that we're all people. And those relationships are what really pave the way for this idea that we can have it all, because we are all working together. And I guess that is all I was going to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anyone has questions, raise your hand and I will bring the mic so that it's all on the audio. And we'll start with them.
I'd just like to make a couple of comments, and I'd like you to comment on my comment. It strikes me that Morris sort of got a bad rap from all the criticism he got in the 1950s for two reasons. I remember a book called Populux, and one of the facts in there that was mentioned, which has always struck me, the author, Eric Hines, said that in the United States during the 1950s, outside of Miami Beach and Las Vegas, there were a grand total of 8 hotels built. 8 long-stay hotels, which sounds like an astonishing fact, but then I thought about my hometown in Boston, and I can't think of anything that was built there in the 50s, because all the cities were dead. So for one, you have this issue that in the 50s, that particular building type, large-scale hotels, there were so few of them that anything would really get noticed. They were only built in places where there was fantasy going on. That's certainly true of Miami Beach. And it just struck me as I was thinking of Ira Giller, your dad. You know, of course, we only have a history of fantasy hotels here, at least back then. You know, they had the Art Deco hotels. But then maybe, what was it, 5 years before your dad was building those fantasy 2-story hotels in Sunny Isles.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if, you know, in that context where Morris was building, of course it was just so much easier for him to spread his wings and do stuff to appeal to a fantasy clientele, not a business clientele, and then he sort of gets nailed for it. And I just wondered what you thought.
I think it's somewhat ironic when you look at his body of work for all of the fantasy versus business. He dealt with some pretty heavy business people, successful business people. Trump, Ted Arison,
Tish,
Musk, Sofer. So for the Jewish architect that was trying to strive to build for the royalty and the wealthy in the tradition of the architects of past centuries, he got there. He got there, and it was much more beyond the fantasy. The fantasy put him on the map, but then he continued and.
it was good business too.
Yeah, but it wasn't just I was going to say, it was good business because, by the way, of those 8 built outside of Miami and Las Vegas, Lapidus did probably half of those too. So I think he just really understood how hotels worked. He was the go-to guy for a hotel. He was the Schultz and Weaver of the 1950s, right? Schultz and Weaver did all the hotels in the 20s, you know, also in the same track, New York, Miami, Havana, the Caribbean, right? And Morris dominated that because he understood the commercial end of it. He understood the, you know, the fantasy end of it, and even with the less fantastical ones, you know, the ones in New York that he did. The Summit and the Americana are both, you know, I mean, they had some, connection to that theme, but they were much more sober hotels. But he still was the guy.
You talk about business. You said he had a business sense. I had a conversation with him once. He was comparing his practice with the practice I had with my dad in terms of the work we were doing. My dad was in the hotels and the motels and moved on in the 60s to more corporate institutional work. And when we were having these lunches in the 50s, in the 80s particularly, we were still doing that kind of work. And we started comparing getting paid. There's this very famous story about Novak and going after him with a 2x4 about getting paid. But Morris said, the Gillers are while you may not be as into these flamboyant projects, you're getting paid for what you're doing, because the government work and the corporate work, they may take a little longer to pay, but they paid. He had to fight with a lot of his clients to get paid in full. And it was very typical of a lot of the developers in the 50s and the 60s to do a lot of shopping around with architectural services. They get to the end of the project and you never see your last payment. Or some of the developers to go to Allan, to Ira, and say, what are your thoughts on this? And you know, we'd say, oh, an opportunity, and we'd do some free sketches, and then, but they never move ahead. So we didn't get paid. We gave away our services for free.
Right.
Having observed that many times as a very young architect, I made it a point to, you want my thoughts, you want my services, let's sign a contract and come up with money.
Yeah.
This was one of Morris's frustrations that he had with some of these clients that we don't quite deify, but we look at them and say, wow, look at what they did together. I think some of the inside architecture story will find that some of what we've read in as past history really wasn't there, and some of the relationships were good and some of them weren't.
Yeah.
And the real symbol of what was successful was the repeat with the Aventuras to so many buildings, or with the Tisches with so many buildings. It was a good relationship. The ones that didn't last, Novak was a one-off.
Well, in light of that, I know we're ending, but I wanted to say the Tisch story was the story that he started his life with me with. So when he went to Charlie Rose, when he won the National Design Award, he said, what should I talk to Charlie about? I said, tell him the story you told me. It hooked me. Try it again. So if you go to November 14th, 2000, Charlie Rose interviews him, and he talks about the Tisch family and the fact that he designed. When you go to Monte Carlo and you see that we have all these great, the red carpet, you know, all of the film industry has all of their airings there, that's a Lapidus hotel. But they cut his name off of it because the German financier did not want a Jewish architect. And that story is told on Charlie Rose.
Really?
So I think it's very interesting that these kinds of stories were the things that got my interest about Lapidus, the stories of, you know, working with people and how he worked with people. And also that was the worst moment of his life, was when his designs were stolen. You know, he really suffered that. You know, architects do suffer when their ideas are stolen. Okay, not stolen, he got paid for the 90%, but his name was never on the Monte Carlo building, and that was his greatest building, he thought. I thought I would mention that. So do watch the Charlie Rose show from November 14th, 2000, and that was the story he told me.
All right, well, I wanted to say thank you again to our amazing panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Also, Deborah, I want to thank you again for putting together this whole lecture.
Yeah. Great job. This is really.
We'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Very good.